A fortune hinges on a single mistranslated word over dessert. Crystal glasses clink under low amber lights, masking a multi-million-dollar corporate trap. One exhausted waiter carrying a tray of dirty plates hears the deception. He has two choices: keep walking or risk everything to warn a ruthless stranger. $72. Dean felt the receipt paper crumple in his apron pocket, the cheap thermal paper damp with condensation from a dozen water pitchers. $72 was the exact cost of Maya's generic brand inhaler out of pocket. It was also, coincidentally, the exact price of the Wagyu Carpaccio appetizer, currently sitting on the tray balanced precariously on his left fingertips. The dining room of Osteria di Lusso smelled intensely of roasted garlic, white truffle oil, and the faint ozone sterility of expensive air purifiers. It was a Tuesday night. The ambient noise was a low, moneyed hum, the sound of deals being made, affairs being discreetly managed, and fortunes shifting hands over plates of pasta that cost more than a tank of gas. A dull ache radiated from the arch of Dean's right foot, shooting up his calf and settling deep in his lower back. His cheap polyester blend uniform pants chafed at the thighs. He had been on his feet for 9 hours. His shift was supposed to end at 10, but the private party at Table 7 had decided to linger. Table 7 was currently occupied by 3 people, but it possessed the gravity of a black hole, warping the entire restaurant's service around it. At the head of the table sat Vivian Hayes. Dean knew her name because the maitre d' had practically hyperventilated during the pre-shift briefing. CEO of Hayes Logistics, a woman who had inherited a failing freight empire and ruthlessly dragged it back into the black. Up close, she didn't look like the tyrant the business magazines painted her as. She just looked incredibly, bone-deep tired. She wore a charcoal suit that fit like armor, the fabric absorbing the dim restaurant lighting. Her posture was rigidly perfect, but Dean noticed the subtle, repetitive motion of her left thumb rubbing the joint of her index finger. There was a faint smudge of ink on her knuckle. She drank her sparkling water without ice, taking slow, measured sips as if rationing her energy. Across from her sat Valerio Costa. He was a Milanese shipping magnate, a man built like a luxury refrigerator. Broad, imposing, encased in a bespoke navy suit that strained slightly at the shoulders. He smelled heavily of bergamot and expensive cigar smoke, a scent that lingered in the air long after he walked past. Between them sat the translator, Simon. Simon was a slight man with thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore a gray suit that was a shade too light for the evening atmosphere. His hands were soft, resting on a leather portfolio, and he spoke with the polished, frictionless cadence of a man who made a living smoothing over rough edges. Dean approached the table, his movements practiced and invisible. That was the golden rule of Osteria di Lusso. Be a ghost who serves wine. Wagyu Carpaccio, garnished with shaved white truffle and capers, Dean murmured, sliding the chilled porcelain plate onto the heavy linen tablecloth with a soft, muted click. Vivian didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on Valerio. She offered a tight, professional smile. Tell Mr. Costa that I appreciate his flexibility on the maritime routes. However, the East Coast ports are non-negotiable. My infrastructure there is the core of this merger. Simon nodded, turning to Valerio. He began to speak in rapid, fluid Italian. Dean stepped back, adjusting the heavy silver water pitcher in his hand. He poured a splash of San Pellegrino into Vivian's glass. And as he did, he listened. Dean wasn't just a waiter. 6 years ago, before the custody battle, before the bankruptcy, before Maya's medical bills started piling up, he had been married to a woman from Palermo. They had lived in Sicily for 4 years. He had learned Italian not in a classroom, but in loud, chaotic kitchens, arguing with contractors and haggling in street markets. He didn't just know textbook Italian. He knew the slang. He knew the regional dialects. He knew the subtle, cutting insults native speakers used when they thought foreigners weren't listening. Simon's Italian was flawless. But what he said to Valerio wasn't what Vivian had asked him to say. "She is desperate," Simon said to Valerio in Italian, his tone dripping with condescension. "She is trying to hold on to the East Coast ports, but she doesn't have the capital. Push her on it. She will fold." Dean's hand froze for a fraction of a second. A single drop of condensation fell from the pitcher, landing on the tablecloth and blooming into a dark, wet circle. Valerio's eyes gleamed. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his fork. He spoke around a mouthful of carpaccio, his accent thick and aggressively northern. "Bene, lasciala sanguinare. Le daremo il 20% in meno di quanto concordato. Se non accetta, andiamo dai cinesi." "Good. Let her bleed. We will give her 20% less than agreed. If she doesn't accept, we go to the Chinese." Simon turned back to Vivian. His polite plastic smile returned instantly. "Mr. Costa says he completely understands your position on the East Coast ports," Simon told her in perfect, unaccented English. "He is willing to concede them to your management, provided we finalize the rest of the operational timeline tonight." Vivian's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The tension in her jaw eased. It was a microscopic display of relief, but Dean caught it. She believed him. She actually believed she was winning. Dean backed away from the table, stepping into the shadows near the service station. His heart was suddenly beating entirely too fast. The heavy silver pitcher felt slick in his grip. "None of your business," he told himself. "Rich people, eating rich people. It has nothing to do with you." He set the pitcher down on the metal counter of the service station. The kitchen door swung open violently, letting out a blast of blistering heat, the smell of searing meat, and the chaotic shouting of the head chef. A busboy shoved past Dean with a bin full of clattering silverware. Dean pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked. A text message from Mrs. Gable, Maya's babysitter, sat on the lock screen. "Maya's cough is acting up again. Gave her the medicine. You'll be home by 11, right?" He needed this job. He needed the tips from table 7. If he caused a scene, if he embarrassed a VIP guest, he wouldn't just be fired. The manager, a petty tyrant named Eris, would make sure he was blacklisted from every fine dining establishment in the city. He'd be back to flipping burgers or hauling boxes, and Maya's insurance would vanish overnight. He looked back across the dining room. Vivian Hayes was nodding slowly, tapping a silver pen against her leather notebook. She was calculating margins. She was planning the future of a company she had bled for, based on a translation that was entirely maliciously fabricated. Dean closed his eyes. The smell of bleach from the rag bucket burned his nostrils. He shoved his phone back into his pocket. "Just pour the wine, Dean. Just pour the wine and go home." The main courses arrived. Branzino encased in a sea salt crust for Vivian, a heavily marbled ribeye for Valerio, and a modest saffron risotto for Simon. Dean moved mechanically, orchestrating the clearing of the appetizer plates and the resetting of the silverware. The physical labor of the job was automatic, leaving his brain entirely too much room to process the conversation happening inches from his hands. The dining room had thinned out. It was past 10:30. The low murmur of the remaining patrons was drowned out by the intense, laser-focused negotiation at Table 7. "The integration of our fleets is the next hurdle," Vivian said, her voice raspy with fatigue. She reached for her water glass, her eyes locked on Valerio. "I will not authorize a complete turnover of my domestic drivers. My people know the routes. They have pensions. We need a phased integration over 36 months. She looked at Simon. "Make sure he understands that. 36 months. No immediate layoffs." Simon wiped his mouth with his linen napkin. He cleared his throat and leaned toward Valerio. La stupida vuole proteggere I suoi autisti," Simon said in Italian. "The idiot wants to protect her drivers." "Le ho detto che ci vorranno 3 anni. Appena firma, licenzia tutti. Usa la clausola di ristrutturazione nel contratto." "I told her it will take 3 years. As soon as she signs, fire everyone. Use the restructuring clause in the contract." Valerio chuckled. It was a wet, heavy sound that made Dean's stomach turn. Valerio sawed off a piece of his ribeye, the blood pooling on the white ceramic plate. "Certo che lo farò," Valerio replied, chewing open-mouthed. "Questa azienda è una carcassa gonfia. Prenderemo I camion, venderemo I magazzini e butteremo il resto." "Of course I will. This company is a bloated carcass. We will take the trucks, sell the warehouses, and throw away the rest." Dean stood near the wine cooler, a bottle of Barolo in his hands. He was supposed to be decanting it. He held the corkscrew, the sharp metal tip biting into his thumb. A bloated carcass. Valerio was planning a hostile gutting of the company. This wasn't a merger. It was a slaughter. And Simon, the man Vivian was paying to be her voice, was the one handing Valerio the knife. Simon turned back to Vivian. The fake smile stretched across his face, pulling the skin tight over his cheekbones. "Mr. Costa deeply respects your loyalty to your employees," Simon translated smoothly. "He agrees to the 36-month phased integration. He views your current drivers as a vital asset to the newly formed company and is excited to work with them." Vivian exhaled. It was a long, shaky breath that she quickly tried to hide by taking a sip of water. But Dean saw it. He saw the way her shoulders slumped, the way she ran a hand through her hair, pushing it back from her forehead. She looked vulnerable. For a split second, the armor cracked. She was just a woman trying to keep her head above water, trying to protect the people who depended on her. Dean felt a sudden sharp pang of recognition. It was the same feeling he got when he sat at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., staring at a stack of bills, doing the terrifying mental math of deciding which utility to let slide this month. The scale was different, millions of dollars versus hundreds, but the weight was exactly the same. The crushing, suffocating pressure of being the only one holding the roof up. If she signs that contract, Dean realized, thousands of people are going to lose their jobs. Truck drivers, warehouse workers, people like me. He looked at Valerio. The man was practically glowing with greed, his eyes darting to the thick leather folder sitting near Simon's elbow. The contracts. Dean uncorked the Barolo. The pop of the cork sounded like a gunshot in his own ears. He poured a small amount into a tasting glass and approached the table. "For your approval, sir," Dean said, placing the glass near Valerio. Valerio didn't even look at him. He waved a dismissive hand, still staring at Vivian. Va bene, versalo basta, garzone. Fine, fine. Just pour it, errand boy. Dean's jaw tightened. He poured the dark red wine into the large balloon-shaped glasses. The aroma of dark cherries and oak wafted up, mingling with the heavy scent of Valerio's cologne. "Oh, so we are in agreement on the core terms," Vivian said, leaning forward. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a heavy silver Montblanc pen. The metallic scratch of the cap being twisted off seemed to echo in the quiet corner of the restaurant. "I believe we are, Ms. Hayes," Simon said. He reached for the leather folder, his fingers trembling slightly with barely contained excitement. He flipped it open, revealing stacks of dense, legally binding paper. "Mr. Costa has already signed his portion. If you will just sign here and here. The restructuring clause on page 42 just formalizes the timeline we discussed." Dean stepped back. His hands were empty now. The tray was gone. The wine was poured. He had no excuse to remain at the table. "Walk away, Dean. Go back to the kitchen. Check your phone. Maya needs you. You cannot afford this." He took one step backward. His heel hit the soft, thick carpeting. Valerio was watching Vivian with the predatory stillness of a snake. Simon was pointing to the dotted line, holding the pages flat. Vivian positioned the tip of the pen over the paper. The ink glistened under the amber pendant light hanging above the table. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon she couldn't possibly read fast enough to verify. She trusted the man beside her. She had no reason not to. Dean looked at the back of Vivian's neck. He saw the tension cord standing out beneath her collar. He saw the exhaustion. He thought about a truck driver somewhere in Ohio, maybe a guy with a kid with asthma who was about to lose his health insurance because of a mistranslated sentence. Damn it. "Excuse me." The words left Dean's mouth before his brain could fully process the catastrophic consequences of speaking them. His voice wasn't loud, but in the hushed, intimate bubble of Table 7, it hit like a dropped anvil. The scratching of the pen stopped. 3 heads turned to look at him. Vivian's expression was flat, mildly annoyed by the interruption. Valerio frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in a scowl. Simon looked up, his polite smile faltering, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his eyes. "Yes?" Vivian asked. Her tone was pure ice. The CEO was back. The armor was up. "Is there a problem with the bill?" Dean stood frozen for 2 excruciating seconds. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. The ambient chatter of the restaurant seemed to drop away entirely. He could hear the hum of the AC unit. He could hear his own pulse hammering against his eardrums. He looked at Simon. Simon glared back, giving a minute sharp shake of his head. "Go away, waiter." Dean took a breath. He stepped forward, closing the distance to the table. He ignored Valerio. He ignored Simon. He locked eyes entirely with Vivian. "Ma'am, do not sign that contract," Dean said. His voice was steadier this time, carrying a low, rough edge. Vivian stared at him. The sheer audacity of the statement seemed to short-circuit her brain for a moment. She looked from Dean to the contract and back to Dean. "I'm sorry. What did you just say to me?" she asked, her voice dropping dangerously low in volume. Simon jumped in, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor as he half stood. "Apologies, Miss Hayes. The waitstaff here seems to have lost their minds. I will get the manager immediately." "Sit down, Simon," Vivian snapped, her eyes never leaving Dean. She didn't raise her voice, but the command carried absolute authority. Simon dropped back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. Vivian studied Dean. She took in his cheap uniform, his tired eyes, the faint sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead. "You have exactly 5 seconds to explain why you are interrupting my dinner, or I will have you removed by security." Dean's stomach did a violent flip. He planted his feet. There was no going back now. "Because your translator is lying to you," Dean said. Silence slammed down on the table. Simon turned the color of old parchment. "This is outrageous," he sputtered, his voice cracking. "Ms. Hayes, this man is clearly unhinged. He's a waiter." Valerio, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, but unable to understand the rapid English, slammed his hand on the table. The silverware rattled. "Che diavolo sta succedendo?" "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, looking at Simon. Dean didn't wait for Simon to sanitize the translation. He looked directly at the Milanese billionaire and spoke in rapid, guttural, perfectly accented Italian. "Le sto dicendo che hai intenzione di sventrare la sua azienda e licenziare I suoi autisti, pezzo di merda." "I am telling her that you plan to gut her company and fire her drivers, you piece of shit." Valerio's mouth fell open. The color drained from his face, replaced instantly by a flush of dark, violent red. He stared at the waiter as if a dog had just stood up and recited Shakespeare. Vivian's eyes widened. She looked at Valerio's shocked, guilty expression, then at Simon's pale, sweating face, and finally back to Dean. The puzzle pieces were clicking together in her head at lightning speed. "Translate what you just said to him," Vivian commanded Dean. "Ms. Hayes, please. You cannot listen to the help," Simon pleaded, reaching out to cover the contract with his hands. Vivian slammed her hand down over Simon's, pinning his fingers to the table. Her eyes were lethal. "If you open your mouth again, Simon, I will have my legal team bury you so deep you won't see daylight until the next century." "Speak," she ordered, looking at Dean. Dean swallowed hard. When you asked for the 36-month integration, he didn't tell him that. He told him that you were an idiot trying to protect your drivers. Valerio told him to use the restructuring clause on page 42 to fire everyone the second you sign. He called your company a bloated carcass. He plans to sell the warehouses and scrap the rest. Vivian slowly pulled her hand away from Simon's. She looked down at the leather folder. She reached out, her movement slow and deliberate, and flipped to page 42. She read in silence for 10 seconds. 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Dean watched her jaw tighten. He watched the knuckles of her hands turn white as she gripped the edges of the paper. When she looked up, the exhaustion was gone. The woman sitting at the table was terrifying. She turned to Valerio. Valerio was already standing up, buttoning his suit jacket with furious, jerky movements. He began shouting in Italian, gesturing wildly at Simon, blaming the translator, feigning outrage. Vivian didn't even blink. She picked up her glass of sparkling water and smoothly, deliberately, poured the entire contents over the open contract. The water pooled over the thick paper, instantly smearing the ink of Valerio's signature into a blue, illegible mess. "This dinner's over," Vivian said softly. "You crazy bitch," Simon yelled, entirely dropping the polished professional facade. "You need this deal. You're bankrupt without his capital. I'd rather burn the company to the ground myself than hand it to scavengers, Vivian replied. She picked up her leather notebook and her phone. She looked at Valerio, who was still shouting. Tell him, she looked at Dean, that if he ever sets foot in one of my logistics hubs, I will have him arrested for trespassing, and tell him to pay the bill. Dean looked at Valerio. He delivered the message in Italian, adding a colorful, highly localized Sicilian insult at the end for good measure. Valerio grabbed his coat, threw a string of curses at Simon, and stormed out of the dining room, nearly knocking over a busboy. Simon scrambled out of his chair, grabbing his ruined briefcase. He pointed a trembling finger at Dean. You are dead in this city. You hear me? You'll never work in hospitality again. He turned and practically ran toward the exit. Suddenly, the table was very quiet. The ruined contract sat in a puddle of water. The expensive steaks were growing cold. Dean stood there, the adrenaline crashing out of his system, leaving him feeling hollow and dizzy. His legs were shaking. He had done it. He had stopped the deal, and he had just torpedoed his life. Ares, the restaurant manager, was suddenly speed-walking across the dining room floor, his face purple with rage. He had clearly seen the shouting, the VIPs fleeing, the spilled water. Dean! Ares hissed, grabbing him by the arm with bruising force. What the hell did you do? You're fired. Get your things and get out of the back door before I call the police. Dean didn't fight him. He let Ares pull him away from the table. It was over. He had to go home and figure out how to tell Maya they were losing their apartment. Wait. The word cut through the dining room like a whip. Ares stopped, turning around with a sickeningly sweet, apologetic smile. Miss Hayes, I am so profoundly sorry. This man is unstable. He is being terminated immediately. Let go of his arm, Vivian said. She was standing now, putting on her charcoal overcoat. Ares blinked, confused, but his grip loosened. Dean pulled his arm away. Vivian walked around the table. She stopped directly in front of Dean. She looked at his name tag, then up into his face. Her gaze was intense, analytical, sweeping over his tired eyes, the cheap uniform, the defensive set of his shoulders. What is your name? She asked. Dean Russo, he said quietly. Well, Dean Russo, Vivian said, pulling a sleek, embossed business card from her pocket and holding it out to him. It seems you just saved me $80 million and 3,000 pensions. And it seems you just lost your job. Dean looked at the card. He didn't take it. I didn't do it for you, he said defensively, the cynicism bleeding through. I did it because your translator was a snake, and I know what happens to the guys at the bottom when companies get gutted. A faint, genuine smile touched the corners of Vivian's mouth. It was the first real expression he had seen from her all night. I prefer employees who are honest rather than polite, Vivian said. I need someone who can read a room, understands complex negotiations, and apparently speaks fluent, aggressive Italian. Call that number tomorrow at 9 a.m. I'm hiring you. Dean stared at her, stunned. Hiring me? For what? Vivian buttoned her coat. To make sure I never sit at a table with liars again. She turned and walked out of the restaurant, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the hardwood, leaving Dean standing in the middle of the dining room, holding a blank business card that felt heavier than the tray he had been carrying all night. The night bus smelled of wet wool, diesel exhaust, and stale beer. Dean sat in the back row, staring at the window. The glass was cool against his forehead, vibrating with the heavy rumble of the engine. His right foot throbbed. a relentless, dull spike of pain radiating from his heel up to his kneecap. He slipped his hand into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed against two things: the crumpled $72 receipt for Maya's inhaler and the thick, embossed cardstock of Vivian Hayes' business card. The contrast made him nauseous. One piece of paper represented his drowning, the other represented a life raft tossed from a passing yacht. He didn't trust the raft. Billionaires didn't hand out favors to fired waiters out of the goodness of their hearts. They extracted value. They used people until the usefulness ran out. He walked the 3 blocks from the bus stop to his apartment building. The streetlights flickered, casting long, bruised shadows over the cracked pavement. Inside, the hallway smelled intensely of boiled cabbage and the sharp, piney scent of cheap floor cleaner. He unlocked his door as quietly as possible. The apartment was tiny, barely 400 square feet of peeling linoleum and mismatched thrift store furniture. The only sound was the low, rattling hum of the warm mist humidifier in the corner of the living room. Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor and makeshift babysitter, was asleep in the armchair, her head resting against a floral pillow. Dean touched her shoulder lightly. She jerked awake, blinking behind thick glasses. "Dean, you're late," she whispered, rubbing her eyes. "I know. I'm sorry. The table stayed past closing." He pulled his wallet out, fishing out 3 crumpled $20 bills. "Here. Thank you for staying." Mrs. Gable took the cash, her eyes softening as she looked at his exhausted face. "Maya had a tough time around 8. The cough was deep. I gave her the medicine, but she fought it. She said it tasted like metal." "It's the generic," Dean said, his voice tightening. "I'll get the good stuff next week, I promise." After Mrs. Gable shuffled back down the hall to her own unit, Dean walked into the bedroom. Maya was a tiny lump under a faded superhero comforter. Her breathing was steady now, but he could hear the faint, residual wheeze in her chest. He stood there in the dark for a long time, listening to the rhythm of her lungs. He went to the kitchen, flipped on the harsh overhead fluorescent light, and placed Vivian's card on the chipped formica table. He sat in the rickety wooden chair, took a breath, and stared at the gold leaf lettering. What the hell did I just do? He had no job. He had $50 in his checking account. Rent was due in 12 days. He was a high school graduate with a spotty resume and a talent for picking up regional dialects. He had no degree. He had no corporate experience, but he had a phone number. At 8:45 a.m. the next morning, Dean stood outside the towering glass and steel monolith that housed Hayes Logistics in the financial district. The air here didn't smell like garbage and exhaust. It smelled like expensive espresso and the ozone tang of cold, conditioned air rushing out of revolving doors. He wore his only suit. It was navy blue, bought for a funeral 5 years ago, and the fabric was shiny at the elbows. He felt like an imposter. He felt like a target. The elevator shot up to the 42nd floor with stomach-dropping speed. The reception area was an expanse of white marble and minimalist furniture. "Dean Russo," he told the receptionist, a young woman who looked at his scuffed shoes with brief clinical judgment. "Vivian Hayes told me to be here." He expected to be handed off to HR. He expected to be given a token interview and shown the door. Instead, an executive assistant led him straight down a hushed hallway, opening heavy double doors into a corner office that overlooked the gray sprawl of the city. Vivian Hayes was not sitting behind her massive walnut desk. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, a styrofoam cup of break room coffee in her hand. She looked worse than she had at the restaurant. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, messy knot, and the dark circles under her eyes were stark against her pale skin. "You're early," she said, not turning around. "I don't have a job to go to," Dean replied, his voice flat. He wasn't going to play the grateful peasant. He couldn't afford the energy. Vivian turned. She walked over to her desk, picked up a thick file folder, and tossed it across the polished wood. It slid and stopped exactly at the edge, near Dean's hands. "The board of directors is panicking," Vivian said, taking a sip of the terrible coffee. "Valerio Costa pulled his funding. The stock is taking a hit this morning. Simon, the translator, is threatening to sue me for assault because of the water. It is a disaster." "Sorry to hear it," Dean said. He didn't touch the folder. "Why am I here, Miss Hayes?" Vivian set the cup down. She leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing her arms. "I spent the last 4 hours digging into your background, Dean. You spent 4 years in Palermo, managing a failing olive oil export business for your ex-wife's family. You handled the union disputes, the shipping logistics, and the local suppliers. You brought it back to profitability before the divorce forced you back to the States." Dean's jaw tightened. It was a small operation. It wasn't corporate. It was a bloodbath, Vivian corrected him. You dealt with Sicilian dock workers and local syndicates. You speak 3 dialects of Italian, passable Spanish, and according to your references, which were incredibly hard to track down, by the way, you have an unparalleled ear for a lie. She pointed to the folder. "Open it." Dean hesitated, then flipped the cover back. It was a standard employment contract. The salary number printed on the second page made the breath freeze in his throat. It was more money than he had made in the last 4 years combined. Title: Director of International Negotiations, Vivian said. "You don't need a degree. You need exactly what you showed me last night. An absolute refusal to be cowed by a suit, and the ability to hear what people are actually saying when they think no one is listening." Dean stared at the number. The zeros blurred. He thought of the $72 receipt. He thought of his throbbing feet. He closed the folder. He looked up, meeting her intense, predatory gaze. "I need health insurance," Dean said. His voice was remarkably steady, though his hands were cold. "Not in 90 days, not after a probationary period. I need it active by midnight tonight. Comprehensive. Top tier." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Most people would negotiate the salary. I don't care about the salary. My daughter has chronic asthma. If I'm working your hours, sitting in your meetings, I can't be worrying about whether a hospital visit is going to bankrupt me. Insurance today, or I walk." It was a bluff. A massive, terrifying bluff. If she said no, he had nothing. Vivian stared at him for a long, silent moment. The hum of the city traffic below seemed entirely muted. Then she reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out the silver Mont Blanc pen, and clicked it open. She leaned over the desk, scratched a line of text onto the contract, and initialed it. "HR will process the waiver within the hour," Vivian said. "Your coverage starts at noon." "Don't make me regret this, Dean." "You won't," he said. He picked up the pen. The metal was heavy, still warm from her hand. He signed his name. 3 weeks later, the air in the conference room smelled of dry erase markers and anxious sweat. Dean sat near the back of the room, wearing a tailored charcoal jacket. It fit perfectly, resting lightly on his shoulders. His feet were encased in expensive, supportive leather Oxfords. He wasn't standing. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't standing to earn his living. At the head of the long mahogany table, Vivian was listening to a pitch from a logistics firm based in Madrid. The firm's representatives were slick, heavily cologned, and smiling widely. They spoke rapidly in Spanish, while an interpreter translated for Vivian. Dean watched the lead representative's hands. He watched the subtle tightening of the man's jaw when the topic of fuel surcharges came up. Dean spoke Spanish well enough to follow the broad strokes, but he was listening for the tone. He was listening for the gaps. The representative waved a hand dismissively, speaking to his colleague in rapid, hushed Spanish. No te preocupes. Ocultaremos las tarifas en el anexo de mantenimiento. Dean leaned forward. He tapped his pen twice against his notepad. It was the signal they had agreed upon. Vivian paused mid-sentence. She glanced at Dean. Dean gave a microscopic shake of his head. He mouthed one word, maintenance. Vivian's eyes sharpened. She turned back to the smiling representative. I need to see a fully itemized breakdown of your projected maintenance annex, she said, her voice dropping into that cold, commanding register. Before we discuss any fuel surcharges, the representative's smile cracked. The color drained from his face. Dean leaned back in his chair. The adrenaline still hit him during these moments, but it wasn't the panic of a trapped animal anymore. It was the cold, focused thrill of the hunt. He was the shield. He was the radar. He sat in the shadows of the brightest, most expensive rooms in the world, and he listened to the wealthy lie to each other. That evening, the office was empty. The sun had set, painting the skyline in bruised shades of purple and orange. Dean stood by the break-room coffee machine, waiting for the dark liquid to brew. Vivian walked in, kicking off her heels the moment she crossed the threshold. She sighed, a deep rattling sound, and leaned against the counter next to him. They were going to bury a 12% markup in the maintenance contracts, Vivian said quietly, staring at the dripping coffee. You saved me again. They got sloppy, Dean said, handing her a mug. They look at you and see a woman holding a checkbook. They don't look at the guy in the corner. Vivian took the mug, wrapping her cold hands around the ceramic. Do you miss it? The restaurant? The simplicity? Dean let out a short, harsh laugh. Nothing about being poor is simple, Vivian. It's the most complicated math in the world. I don't miss a single second of it. She looked at him, really looked at him. The exhaustion in her eyes met the lingering cynicism in his. They were entirely different species, operating on different planes of existence, but they shared a fundamental understanding of gravity. They knew what it meant to carry weight. Go home, Dean, she said softly. You've earned your keep today. Dean left the building at 7. He took a cab, not the bus, back to his neighborhood. Before he went to the apartment, he stopped at the pharmacy on the corner. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully. The store smelled of sterile bandages and cheap lavender soap. He walked up to the counter. Picking up for Maya Russo, he said. The pharmacist, a tired woman who knew him by name, tapped at her keyboard. All right, Dean. That'll be $72 for the generic, or... She frowned at the screen. Wait. Your insurance on file updated. It says 0 copay for the brand name steroid inhaler. She looked up, confused. Is this right? Dean rested his hands on the counter. The Formica was cold, smooth, and solid beneath his palms. He didn't feel the phantom ache in his lower back. He didn't feel the crushing pressure in his chest. Yeah, Dean said, a slow, grounded smile breaking across his face, entirely devoid of panic for the first time in years. That's right. Give me the good stuff. If you love this intense story of a single dad turning the tables on corporate greed and securing a future for his daughter, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button, drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment, and share this video with anyone who loves a gritty, satisfying underdog story. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our next deeply human storytelling experience. See you next time.